Hi, it's John Kelly. In this module, we are going to discuss Agreed Upon Procedures Engagements, Section 4400. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, this is a new international section, and as countries around the world do, each country will modify it somewhat, perhaps, for their own particular circumstances. I will describe how Canada has done that, and if you are in a country other than Canada, you need to take a look and see what your country has done that differs from the current standard. Now, the first thing is the effective date, and this is an unusually phrased effective date. It is effective for agreements after January the 1st, 2022. So, in other words, if you don't update your agreement, if you don't update your engagement letter, you would continue to use the old section, perhaps in perpetuity. And that's recognized in A9, which allows using the old section if no updated engagement letter is obtained. So I would get a new engagement letter. The section compared to the old Canadian standard, there's some more documentation, some less documentation, but in the end, it's about the same work effort. There is certainly a much longer engagement letter and a much longer report. Now in Canada, this replaces specified auditing procedures for which the code required independence. And the new phrase is agreed upon procedures, though in the international section and following along in Canada as well, independence is not required. Most of the procedures that are described as procedures that could be agreed upon are auditing procedures, so it sure sounds the same to me, and I don't quite understand why there would be any value if you weren't independent. Never mind, I think probably, I'm not going to think about this anymore. I think I would just recommend it's best to be independent. In the Code of Ethics, I think the most important thing we provide is an independent opinion. Now, compared to the old Canadian section, this is broadened to apply to non-financial information. The old Canadian section applied only to financial information, though you could have, as a practitioner, used the old section and modified it to apply to non-financial information, so it's not that much of a change. They try in paragraph 4 to constrain user expectations. I don't know whether that will be effective because I don't know that users will read the section. Notwithstanding that, they then follow that in paragraph 5 and 6 with a value statement followed by a statement that there is no assurance. So don't quite understand that either. Requires following the code. And as I said before, the key feature in the code is independence. Apparently you don't have to be, and as I said before, I think it's probably just better that you are and ignore this whole discussion. If you do this type of assignment and you're not independent, remember in Canada at least you have to disclose that. And then the standard is developed in the standard, shall we say, way that standards are now all developed. So paragraph 14, there is a statement that you should understand the whole section. That's characteristic of all standards now. Comply with all the requirements, follow the code, use professional judgment. In Canada, paragraph 19 about following the quality control stuff has been skipped. Don't quite understand why. I suppose in practice I would recommend that you follow the QC stuff anyway. And paragraph 20 talks about the use of an expert. Then we have criteria for engagement acceptance, and there are 5 things we have to do. Now, I guess there's 2 ways you could do this. You could have, for every engagement, a checklist of these 5 things, and complete that checklist for each engagement. and you'd have to remember to do that. My recommendation, I think, is you can very easily modify these 5 things and include them in the engagement letter, and then that does it automatically, and you don't have the possibility of forgetting. So the 5 things are: the person hiring you has to agree that the procedures are okay, so that would easily fit in the engagement letter. That the practitioner can get the information to do, and the simplest way to do that is in the engagement letter. The person hiring agrees to provide what information you need. You have to agree that the procedures can be described, and given the kind of unique character of this type of engagement, you might just be better off to have those procedures described in the engagement letter. You have to be sure you can comply with the ethical requirements and that you can comply with the independence requirements, and both of those things can go in the engagement letter. The engagement letter is described in paragraph 24, and it is highly detailed. Just do it, follow it. There is an example provided. Just use it. I'm not going to go into the details. It's highly detailed. There's an example. Follow it. The concern, of course, is client expectations. The way the section is written, to some extent you can see that clients might expect that there would be significant value and assurance from this type of engagement, and there isn't. So it's very important to emphasize that in the engagement letter. The report states 3 or 4 times that there's no assurance provided. The other thing it specifies or states is that you may need to amend the engagement letter during the engagement because things may change. That just talks about how complicated such an engagement could be. Have an engagement letter at all times. Now, this section is also written the same way all other sections are now written, where the standards say get an engagement letter before you begin the engagement. So have an engagement letter dated before you start. And there's no way that just has to be done. First year of a new engagement, get an engagement letter dated before you start. Then what the section says is every year, think about whether or not you need to update the letter. And if you look at other places in standards, there are 5 or 6 or 7 things that you would think about if you wanted not to update the letter. So again, my view is that would take an hour or 2, and you might forget to do it, and you might forget to document it. So the simplest way to do this is just get a new one every year. You've got last year's letter, you can update the date and get the client to sign it again. So I think the simplest thing to do, even though it's not required by standards explicitly, is just get a new engagement letter every year. And I would apply that to every engagement: audits, reviews, compilations, this one, every engagement. Get a new engagement letter every year. Restriction of distribution of the report, and restrict that in the report. That in the old Canadian section was an explicit suggestion that you say in the report, this report is only for use by, and specify the people. So if it gets into someone else's hands and they don't understand what's going on and they rely on it, solves that problem. That's not explicitly in the section like it was in the old Canadian section, but it's suggested in A53. And so I think that's a good idea, and you should just always restrict the distribution of the report in the report. The old Canadian section required training, proficiency, due care, supervision, planning, and objectivity. Training, supervision, and due care are in the code, so even though it's not in the section, it's in the code and you have to do it. Planning and objectivity are omitted, and we've talked about objectivity independence, why that's kind of puzzling in this section. Planning is omitted, and indeed if you look, they took care not to use the word plan anywhere in the new section. It seemed to me that if you're undertaking any kind of engagement, it's just prudent for efficiency and effectiveness to have a plan and not go in an unplanned fashion. So even though planning's not there, I think you should plan the engagement. It says you should consider getting a representation letter, and given all that we've said about the complexity and possibility of misunderstanding, absolutely you should get a representation letter. No question, just automatic. Engagement letter, rep letter, automatic. The report is much longer. Just do it. There was guidance in the old section not to sign a prescribed form. Some of these things I've seen just had a little box and it said approved auditor. Well, of course, that's unsatisfactory. There's no such guidance in the actual section in the new section, but A32 effectively says it. It says don't accept if the report cannot be clear. And I think, if you cannot issue the exact report that's in the section, it's not clear. So a little box, approved auditor, I think you'd perhaps write C attached report in that box. And documentation, only 3 things. Document the terms of engagement, obviously in an engagement letter. Document the nature, timing, and extent of procedures performed. And document the findings from the procedures. Guidance on the use of an expert, and this puzzled me for a bit. Why are we doing this if we're using an expert for everything? And paragraph 20, if you read it, it says you need to think about that, and if the expert is doing everything and we're hardly involved, we probably shouldn't do this assignment, because we need to be involved enough to take responsibility for the work of an expert. So the expert's work would have to be only a small portion of what we needed to do, and we would have to be expert ourselves enough to undertake the report. So, in summary, get an annual engagement letter, always do that. Get a representation letter, always do that. Independence, as I said, is probably a good idea. It's not required. Don't get that, but it's probably just a good idea. Probably restrict the distribution to the person that engaged you and do that within the report. Probably should plan. That's just efficient and effective. And certainly use exactly the new report wording from the section. So, thanks for listening.